The concept of HR planning is important because we might risk hiring too many people, in which case we'll have inflated labor costs and probably some social loafing happening. But we might also have too few people, which means we're going to use overtime really aggressively, or we might in fact hire the wrong people. So HR planning is quite important to an organization. Who should be part of the HR planning team? Well, essentially you want to have a mix of a lot of people on this team so that they can add different values. For example, maybe strategic planners can think about the longer term plan and what's going to be done. Line managers might say, well, we need more people or less people. HR professionals obviously have the expertise, but finance and budget also comes into play because labor is a very expensive function for a lot of organizations. Before we start, we need to determine what is the right planning horizon, as well as who do we already have. So what's the right horizon? Actually can be short-term or long-term. A lot of companies will come up with a 3-month plan or a 4-year plan, and the variety really varies. And who do we already have? So that includes using our HR inventory as well as looking at the external workforce. There's a number of steps here in the HR process, but what's important for you is actually demand and supply analysis can happen concurrently. It doesn't mean they have to happen separately because they're two different functions, and I'll walk you through that. But once we've got demand and supply analysis, we can do an assessment of the gap and then evaluate the effectiveness of that plan. Let's start by only taking a look at supply. So like I said, demand and supply analysis can happen concurrently. They don't have to happen in a specific order, but they're two distinct functions. For demand specifically, it's about, do we have what we need to meet our projections? Whereas for supply, it says, how many workers do we currently have? So it's more, what do we need versus what do we have? Let's focus in on the worker supply. When it comes to supply, there's some external supply issues we need to be aware of as well. So is there supply for certain types of jobs? Is there high competition for talent? Is an economy or an industry in growth? What's going on with labor force participation? Are more women in the labor force, more immigrants? How do we respond to that? And a lot of these things that we actually discussed in Chapter 1. Here's an example of an external supply consideration. So the growth in the working age population and labor force in Canada traditionally was quite high. We had between 2 and 4% growth annually in the labor force. But what we see is for 2010 to 2011, it was less than 1%. So we've got this period where we're hitting less than 1% growth rate in the working age and in the population of the labor force. In that case, it means that if we've got a lot of people retiring, we're not growing the labor force the way that we need to. If you're an organization that projects 5% growth or 10% growth, and the labor force is only growing 1%, you're going to be really competing for talent. And that's what's led to this skill scarcity. Another thing is that there's broad occupational grouping and growth in those jobs. So for example, although we know there's only been 1% growth in the labor force population, healthcare sector has been increasing jobs on average 2.7%. Primary industries is the lowest at 0.9%, but what you see is all of these numbers are over 1%. So all of these sectors are fighting for the labor that is more scarce. So we actually have a very natural situation where people are where organizations are looking to grow their organization, but the population and the labor force isn't growing at the same level. Increases competition for talent. What are the key findings from this type of research? Well, first is immigration alone can't offset the population and workforce aging. We need to come up with automation, technology, different ways to think about the ways that we do work so we can think about how we can have the types of workers that we need. Labor is becoming more scarce, and that's driving up wages. If you've got three companies that want to hire one worker, they have to compete on wages. There's also a lot of incentives now for youth to invest in the skills that we actually need. So you'll see that there's been some changes to post-secondary education in Canada, and there's a lot more grants, and there's MyTax and training available for youth because we need them to develop skills for certain types of industries and jobs. Essentially, the dearth of skills and the growing skills required for a job results in a mismatch that's going to create a bit of a pressure cooker environment for for employers. And we see that pressure cooker environment right now where top talent is really high in demand. There's also unemployment among scientists, technologists, managers, and analysts, lawyers, and accountants that is traditionally very low. These groups of people traditionally have less than 3% unemployment. So while we have seen some discussions about the challenges of becoming employed, These groups specifically have low unemployment rates, so there's more competition for labor, and you don't go and recruit in the open market. You have to find more creative ways to recruit workers when unemployment is so low. There's also a function when it comes to HR planning about making sure that we're comparing apples to apples. So if we've got 2 part-time workers who are working 20 hours a week, and then 4 part-time workers who are working 40 hours a week, and then 1 full-time worker who's working 40 hours a week, those are all relatively equivalent when we amalgamate them, that collectively 2 part-time workers at 20 hours a week equals 1 full-time worker at 40 hours a week. The term that we use is FTE, full-time equivalent, and it's the common metric we use, and we say roughly 40 hours equals full-time, or 35 hours equals full-time, whatever might be our industry standard. And then we calculate how many hours people work to determine full-time equivalents. It doesn't matter if we populate these people with full-time, part-time, contract, overtime, it doesn't matter, we're saying the number of full-time workers we need. There's also some internal supply considerations, and the primary consideration here being turnover. Turnover can be voluntary, people who decide to leave the organization, who quit, who resign, who decide to retire, who move on and take a leave of absence. Lots of different reasons for voluntary, and it can be involuntary. Involuntary includes when we fire someone for performance reasons, we dismiss them for poor behaviors at work, or when we engage in mass layoffs. So in those cases, these are all examples of where the individual was involuntarily unemployed. But these all factor into the flow of employees out of the organization, which does affect our internal supply. To counter that, there are recruitment policies, but we'll get into that next chapter. However, there's going to be a balance and a war going on almost between the turnover and the recruitment because they're opposite ends of the same spectrum. They both affect internal supply. The textbook talks about a number of examples, and I want to walk you through these examples. So trend analysis is essentially really good when the past trends and ratios are really stable assessments of the future. So we've got a past trend, and we know that working in a stable environment, we'd use trend analysis. Let me give you a simplified example. Over the last 4 years, the sales department at Walmart experienced an average rate of voluntary turnover of 20% and involuntary turnover of 25%. This year, there are 100 sales employees at Walmart. Based on the trend analysis, what is the predicted number of vacancies that Walmart will have to fill? So how many people more will we need? So the first step in this is for us to determine how many employees have left, and let's take a look at that. The total number of employees that we had was 100. The voluntary turnover was 20%, so there's 20 vacancies from that. Involuntary turnover was 25%, so there's 25 vacancies that come from that. If we want to sustain ourselves, then we need to fill 45 vacancies. But essentially, our HR supply is going down by 45%, or 45 out of 100 employees in this example. Let's think more about skills and competency models. So skills and competency models are much more focused on what the core competencies are. So back in job analysis in that chapter, we talked about competencies. Let me give you a simplified competency model example for forecasting. Management at an RBC call center wants to expand, and they want to expand into Quebec, and they realize that they need to get people who can speak both languages. Right now, 10% of their 150 employees are bilingual, predominantly with the remainder having English as their primary language. In Canada, however, 30% of potential customers speak only French. Now, this is for the example out of Quebec, okay? So it's just a made-up example. These numbers aren't real. How many more French-speaking staff will the call center need to help it meet its objective? So it wants to meet and have representation for the 30% potential customers who speak French only. The desired competency means that if we've got roughly 30% of the market speaking French, we should have roughly 30% of our employees speaking French. 30% of our 150 employees means that we should have 45 employees who speak French. Currently, 10% of employees speak French, so that's 15. Essentially, we need 30 more French-speaking employees. So that's the way that you can get into this example. I hope that this helps you think about competencies and how these numbers add up, and it's quite numeric this way. What's important here is that not all roles will use competencies. This was a survey done by the Conference Board of Canada that said which roles do have clearly defined set of competencies, and we find that services, professional, scientific, financial, government, these generally have competencies. You're less likely to use competency models in manufacturing or natural resources or food, beverage, and tobacco, or in publishing. So in these cases, what we want to do is think about the type of job we have and align our HR plan model to the type of jobs that we're also hiring for. And this is an important learning for you that extends beyond what's in the textbook. Internal supply can also be done using replacement charts. So we need to figure out when we promote from within, and we've got heavy promote from within policies, that's leaving a vacancy behind. And how do we move people into that vacancy? Here's an example for you, and this might be in the textbook, but we've got someone who's a president and a CEO, and we have some indicators. What's their present performance, promotional potential, as well as their education level. And what we do here is we don't just think about replacing the president. We go down and we start thinking about, okay, well, if I replace a president with one of these four, who are their possible replacements? So what you see here is actually a major echo effect happening in the organization, that if you pull someone up to the top and then you pull someone to the next role and then you pull someone to the next role, eventually you need to be able to follow that HR plan to say at what point would I actually be hiring. Replacement charts are quite useful for hiring purposes, especially in executive positions. Executive positions generally do have a succession plan in place as well. So it's a long-term process, 2 to 5 years often, where we're grooming someone based on their perceived competencies for the critical positions in the organization. Replacement can be many different levels in the organization, but succession planning is for those critical roles. I know if there's a major realtor in an organization, then they may have a relationship with a junior realtor and they're preparing them for the eventual retirement. So in that case, you know that in a couple of years when this person retires, you're getting groomed for their job. There's also staffing tables, which are visual depictions of where employees are, and these are often done using human resource information systems. So it's a report that gets generated for you from the existing human resource information system, which can be as simple as an Excel spreadsheet, or it could be as complicated as some of the third-party HRIS out there. Internal hiring by job category is also an important consideration, because if we have vacancies filled from within, that's going to create a requirement for us to be aware of the staffing tables and the replacement plans. So for example, for sales, generally 35% of the people in sales get brought in from within the organization. In management, the percentage is significantly higher, 68, 70%. So if you are thinking about management jobs, it's important for you to know that these generally get brought in from within the organization as a potential job seeker. But outside of this, we have to think about if we're bringing people in from our organization, that means that my internal supply, I need to be aware of not just my specific discipline, but what's going on in the areas around me, because I'm going to be hiring people internally. There's also the Markov analysis, and really it gets a way to think about who's getting promoted, who's getting demoted, who's getting transferred, and who's exiting out of the organization. That makes a lot of sense. And it's really best for hierarchical organizations where there's linear career paths. And if you do eventually end up taking an HR planning class, I'm sure you're going to get into this in more depth. But just the idea of being able to predict performance one year over another is quite an exciting idea, thinking about it in a holistic way. So I hope you have a little bit of an understanding of supply and a quick lecture there, but I want to now focus on demand. So how many people will we need? Supply gives us all the information about how many people we have. Demand says how many people will we need. So it does identify the future workforce requirements required for the organization to achieve its missions. There are the same factors in demand analysis. So there's estimation of productivity. What kind of jobs will we have? What kind of budget do we have? What's the expected demand for our services? How many sales do we anticipate? Will we get that major contract? Are there legislative pressures, competitive pressures? All of these things come into play. So demand analysis is a little bit more complicated because it doesn't just involve our internal staff, it involves a lot of external things going on. To do demand analysis, there's a few common techniques, but they're generally split into quantitative and qualitative. Quantitative means based on metrics, qualitative means based on expert judgment. And so we're verbalizing what our estimates are. Let's think about a quantitative method using an example. So trend analysis we talked about with supply. Let's think about trend analysis here with demand. So here we're going to think about a past indicator. Maybe it's the number of rooms that each housekeeper cleans. So in a hotel, maybe each housekeeper can clean 20 rooms per day. A hotel has 1,000 rooms. Based on our demand, we have a projected capacity in the summer of 100% and in the winter of 80%. So that begins to tell me how many employees we need. In this example, in the winter, when we have all 1,000 rooms being used, at 20 rooms per day, we would need 50 housekeepers. And when we've only got 800 rooms in the winter, then we would need 40 housekeepers. So that's a very simplified trend analysis for demand. Ratio analysis determines that the past ratio is a good predictor of future. And in this case, we don't need to have all this historical data to say on average this is what someone does. We can set targets. So for example, maybe we want to bring in 600K in revenue, and we know that each salesperson should target to bring in 200K in revenue. So essentially we need 3 sales employees. So that's a ratio there. It's a sales per employee ratio. Then there's regression analysis. It's a statistical projection using mathematical formulas. And regression analysis ends up with a relationship that if one thing increases, the other thing increases by how many points. Regression analysis ends up with a number that's either a positive or a negative. A negative number means that as you increase one, the other one decreases. A positive number means that if you increase one, the other one increases. For example, age and height in children has a positive relationship. Hopefully, age and whininess in children should have a negative relationship. As one goes up, the other one goes down. So as your age goes up, your amount of whininess goes down. Whininess is a formal term I'm coining right now. However, that number is going to be between a 0 and a 1. So 1 indicates that as one point goes up here, the other one goes up at an equal level. And the lower correlations closer to 0 means that one might move this up a little bit, but there's other causes that are impacting this other factor. We might have a situation where after we've done this analysis, we see 3 years down the road or 3 months down the road, supply is going to exceed demand. How many people we have is higher than the number of people that we need. And this is an occasion that happens quite frequently. And what we might do is engage in hiring freezes, move people from full-time to part-time, get into transfers, think about loaning out our employees, think about laying them off, terminating them, giving them leaves without pays. But there's a way to bring down our numbers. This might be at a business unit level or overall across the organization. And these will be discussed in detail in an upcoming chapter around employee separations. What do we do in the opposite case when demand exceeds supply? So the amount of people we need doesn't match the amount of people we project that we'll have. And this is what we usually think about when it comes to HR. We can hire people, we can transfer people into departments, we can use overtime, we could bring in some part-time workers, some temporary workers, we can do promotions, we can lease employees from other companies. So in this case, it's all these solutions around what happens when our demand exceeds supply. And the next chapters on recruitment and selection really do support the idea of thinking about the strategies we have available when demand exceeds supply.